It was a cold evening in October of 1932 when the Langfords sat down for dinner. The last of the daylight slipped through the lace curtains of their farmhouse in rural Pennsylvania, painting the wooden table in a weak golden glow. The radio in the corner crackled softly, a faint jazz melody fighting against the static. Outside, the wind carried the smell of wet soil and the distant sound of crows. Inside, the family of 5 prepared to eat together, like they always did. Robert Langford, the father, was a man of habit. A former schoolteacher, quiet, rigid, and with a stare that could still silence a room, his wife Margaret stood at the head of the table, her apron still dusted with flour. Their eldest, Thomas, 16, sat across from his mother, sharp-eyed, restless, and lately distant. Beside him sat little Emily, just 10, with a small pink bow in her hair, and finally the youngest, Henry, barely 6, clutching his spoon like a toy sword. The meal was simple: stew, homemade bread, and a small bottle of apple cider that Robert had fetched from the pantry. Nothing about that dinner seemed unusual, and yet by midnight the Langford house would be filled with screams and silence that would never leave the town again. The story begins, as most tragedies do, in whispers. Neighbors would later recall that Margaret had been feeling unwell for days. She'd complained of headaches, dizziness, and strange metallic tastes after meals. Robert, stoic as ever, dismissed it, said it was just the autumn chill or nerves. But behind her calm exterior, Margaret had grown afraid of her own kitchen. She had told her sister just a week before that something in the house didn't feel right anymore. That week, small things had begun to happen. The milk souring overnight, the bread tasting bitter, and the family cat dying suddenly after licking from an unfinished plate. Margaret buried it quietly behind the barn and said nothing. That night, though, the kitchen smelled strange. Not of stew or bread, but something faintly chemical. She noticed it when she lifted the lid off the pot, a sharpness in the air that didn't belong. She glanced at Robert, who was seated by the table reading his paper, the headline barely visible: "Economic collapse deepens. Families lose everything." He looked tired. His eyes didn't move as he read. Still, she served the food. The routine had become a comfort she couldn't break. Thomas, always quick to complain, pushed his bowl away first. "It tastes funny," he muttered. Margaret frowned, dipped her spoon in his bowl, and tasted it herself. A faint bitterness rolled across her tongue like burnt almonds. Before she could speak, Robert looked up, his expression unreadable. "Eat," he said simply. The room fell silent except for the sound of spoons scraping bowls. By 9 o'clock the lamps were dim. The children had gone to bed, and Robert sat by the radio staring into nothing. Margaret washed the dishes, her hands trembling slightly. She couldn't stop replaying the taste in her mouth. Bitter, dry, unnatural. When she glanced at the counter, she noticed the cider bottle still half full. It wasn't theirs. The label looked older, darker, the cork cracked. She didn't remember buying it. At 10:15, Thomas came down the stairs clutching his stomach. His face was pale, his eyes wide. "It hurts," he gasped. Behind him, Emily began to cry. Margaret dropped the dish she was holding. It shattered against the sink, the sound cutting through the stillness of the house. Robert didn't move. He sat staring at his son. "It's just the stew," he said softly. "Go lie down." But Thomas collapsed on the floor, shaking violently. Margaret screamed for Robert to help, but he only rose slowly, his face calm. Too calm. She would later tell the sheriff that when she looked into her husband's eyes, she saw something she'd never seen before. Not anger, not fear, something empty. Within an hour, all 3 children were sick, vomiting, gasping, slipping in and out of consciousness. The air in the room felt heavy, filled with the stench of sweat and iron. Margaret begged Robert to drive them to the doctor, but he didn't move. "It's too late," he whispered. "You shouldn't fight it." That's when she understood. He knew. Her voice broke when she asked him what he'd done. Robert looked at her as if she were the stranger in their home. "It's mercy," he said. "You don't see what's coming, Margaret. The world's ending out there. Better we go together." The panic in her chest turned to fury. She lunged for the phone, but the line was dead. He'd cut it. By 11, the house had gone dark. The radio silent. The children's cries faded one by one. Margaret's body grew weak, her vision blurring as she stumbled toward the back door. She could taste the same bitter flavor rising in her throat. But she made it outside. The cold air slapped her face as she ran barefoot toward the road, screaming for help. The next morning, the sheriff's car stopped by the Langford house after reports from neighbors who'd heard the screams. What they found was quiet. Too quiet. Robert was seated at the table, his head resting on his folded arms as if asleep. Before him sat 4 empty bowls neatly arranged. The stew pot was still warm. In the bedroom they found the children, motionless, peaceful, as though simply asleep after dinner. Margaret was found hours later in a ditch half a mile down the road, barely alive, clutching a handful of dirt and whispering the same word over and over. Cider. The coroner's report was short. Cyanide poisoning, introduced through the food and the cider both. Robert Langford had taken just enough to die last on to watch. He left a letter. One single page folded in half found tucked beneath the radio dial. It read, "I have failed to provide. I cannot watch them starve. We shall dine together one last time, before the hunger takes us all." The newspapers called it the Langford supper tragedy. Reporters came from nearby towns, snapping photographs of the farmhouse, of the untouched dishes, of the letter. But no one could explain why a man once described as gentle and upright had turned to something so unthinkable. Margaret survived, barely. Her lungs burned for weeks from the poison. The doctor said it was a miracle she lived at all. But she never spoke again. For the rest of her days, she lived with her sister in a small cottage on the edge of town, mute, staring out the window each night toward the hills where the farmhouse once stood. Locals said she'd sometimes set an empty table at dusk, 5 places, and sit at one end, her lips moving silently, as if reciting grace. The house itself was left to rot. No one wanted it. The grass grew tall around the fence and the windows cracked one by one. By 1941, a storm finally tore its roof open, and the town council ordered it demolished, but the workers refused to go inside. They said there was a smell, faint, metallic, that lingered even after years of rain, and one of them swore he saw a woman's shadow move past the window upstairs. The sheriff, old and half-blind by then, would tell his grandson decades later that he still dreamed of that night. The table, the bowls, the silence. He said that when he stood there, he thought he heard something faint from the old radio, a single static pulse followed by a man's voice whispering, "It's time for dinner." They burned what was left of the house in the spring of 1942. The ashes blew across the fields, and the town tried to forget. But history has a way of holding its breath, waiting. In 1973, a family named Dalton bought the land and built a new house on the same foundation. They had 2 children, a boy and a girl. Within the first month, the daughter told her parents she could hear people talking downstairs at night, voices that came from the kitchen, even when no one was there. She said they were whispering prayers. Her father laughed, said it was the old pipes creaking, until one morning he came downstairs to find the table fully set, 5 plates, a pot in the middle and a small bottle of cider at the end. No one in the family drank cider. They moved out a week later. The house was sold again and again, each time standing empty a little longer. By the late 1980s, it was known simply as the Langford place. Teenagers dared each other to sneak inside at night. Some claimed they'd found faint burn marks on the floor where the dining table once stood, in the exact shape of a circle. Others said that if you turned on a radio in the kitchen around midnight, you could still hear a man's voice through the static, whispering the same 3 words, "Sit and eat." In 2003, the last owner of the property, a retired historian named Charles Whitman, began researching the Langford case. He collected every surviving record, every article, every piece of testimony. His journal, later found among his belongings, detailed something strange. He'd tested soil samples from the property and found traces of cyanide still present decades later. But more disturbing were the notes he made in the margins, the handwriting growing increasingly erratic. He claimed that every night, at exactly 9 the lights in his kitchen would flicker, and the air would fill with a faint smell of almonds. Neighbors said they hadn't seen him for days before the police entered his home. They found him at his table, pen still in hand, his dinner untouched. The radio was on, and through the static a voice, faint, broken, and barely human, was whispering again. "It's time for dinner." Whitman's death was ruled accidental, a heart attack. But those who'd read his notes weren't so sure. Some said he'd become obsessed, that he'd started reenacting the Langford family's last meal, night after night, trying to understand what Robert Langford had felt. But there's something unsettling about obsession. Sometimes it doesn't just consume the mind. It invites something else in. Local legend says that every October, when the wind turns cold and the air smells faintly sweet, you can still hear a faint clatter from where the house once stood, as though cutlery were being placed carefully on a table, a meal being prepared for guests who never left. And if you stand there long enough, you might hear the faint echo of a woman's voice in the wind, hoarse, trembling, yet unmistakably human, whispering one word over and over: cider. Because that's the thing about the Langford story. No matter how much time passes, the scent of it lingers. Not just in the air, but in memory. The town never rebuilt that part of the field. The land sits quiet, barren, grass flattened in a perfect circle where the foundation once was. And each year, on the anniversary of that night, someone, no one knows who, leaves a bottle of apple cider at the edge of the property, sealed with a cracked cork. Some say it's a cruel joke. Others say it's an offering. But those who've seen it up close swear it's always warm to the touch, as if it's just been poured. And if you hold it to your ear, you can hear the faintest sound of a chair sliding back, someone sitting down, someone waiting. Because the Langfords didn't just die that night. They lingered, and in their ritual, in their silence, in the dinner that was never truly finished. And perhaps that's the cruelest truth of all. In 1932, a family dined together one last time, and in doing so, left a place at the table for anyone who dares to remember them. The Langford story should have ended in 1932, but evil doesn't follow time. It follows memory. For 70 years, the Langford tragedy became a whisper in the town's archives. The kind of story parents mention in warnings to children who wander too far after dark. A simple cautionary tale about poison, madness, and loss. But in truth, it was never over. The meal that began that night hadn't finished. Not really. It had only been waiting for someone else to sit at the table. In the spring of 2004, less than a year after Charles Whitman's mysterious death, the property changed hands again. The buyer was a woman named Evelyn Carr, 32 years old, a historian from Philadelphia with a fascination for unsolved family tragedies. She'd been writing a book about forgotten crimes of the Depression era when she first stumbled on the Langford case. The family that dined together, as newspapers had called them. To her, it was just research. A grim but necessary excavation of the past. She wanted to tell Margaret's side of the story, the survivor who never spoke again. But by the time she signed the purchase papers, the project had already begun to take hold of her in ways she didn't understand. Evelyn arrived at the property in late May. The old foundation was still visible, a pale ring in the soil, surrounded by tall, stubborn weeds. The air was cool even for the season and smelled faintly of apples and dust. The new house was small, modern, made of clean pine and glass, but it stood almost exactly where the Langford dining room once had been. That first night, Evelyn unpacked her books and papers, her voice recorder, her laptop. She had boxes of photographs and clippings, police reports, maps, and testimonies from the old townspeople. Everything she'd collected about the case. By 10 o'clock, the wind began to pick up. The trees outside swayed softly, and a dull hum filled the air. The radio she'd brought from her car flickered with static, even though it wasn't plugged in. Evelyn smiled, brushed it off as faulty wiring, and went back to her notes. She didn't notice the faint smell then, a bitter trace, like burnt almonds. Over the next week, she began interviewing locals. Most of them were reluctant to talk. Some claimed they didn't remember. Others said it was bad luck to mention the Langfords out loud. But one man, Sheriff Dempsey, now in his 80s, agreed to see her. He was the grandson of the original sheriff who'd found the bodies in 1932. He still lived in the same house near the edge of town, his walls lined with old photographs. He told her that his grandfather never spoke much about that night, except once when he was dying. He said the sheriff had been haunted not by the bodies but by what came after. The house stayed wrong, Dempsey said. Every deputy who guarded it at night said the same thing. They'd hear chairs moving upstairs. Smell cider in the air. One of them swore he heard a woman laughing, soft like she was whispering grace. Evelyn leaned forward, her recorder on. Did he ever see anything? Dempsey's eyes clouded. He saw the table, miss. Set for 5. Always 5. No matter how many times they cleared it. That night, back at the house, Evelyn reviewed the tape. When Dempsey's voice faded, she heard something faint beneath his words. A soft clink like glass against wood. She replayed it 3 times, thinking it was background noise. But the sound was steady, rhythmic, like a spoon stirring. By the 3rd week, Evelyn stopped sleeping through the night. The dreams came first. Strange, vivid dreams of a woman standing in a kitchen whispering to herself. Evelyn could never see her face clearly, only the motion of her hand setting plates, pouring something from a bottle into 5 cups. Each time, the dream ended the same way, with the woman turning slowly toward her and saying, "There's always room for one more." She'd wake drenched in sweat, heart pounding, her mouth dry and bitter. By June, she began to notice small changes around the house, objects moving, the scent of apples intensifying at dusk, the lights flickering at exactly 9. One evening, as the clock ticked toward 9, she sat at her desk and decided to stay still, to watch. The air seemed to thicken, the shadows stretched longer. Then from the kitchen she heard the sound, a chair sliding across the floor. Evelyn froze. The sound came again, deliberate this time, like someone was pulling it out from under the table. She stood slowly and walked toward the kitchen doorway. Her reflection in the window looked pale, her eyes dark and wide. The table was empty, perfectly still, and yet there was something new on it, a small glass bottle. She didn't own any glass bottles. The label was worn away. The cork cracked. She stared at it for a long time, her pulse in her throat before whispering, "Who left this?" But there was no answer. Just the faint hiss of the radio in the other room. Evelyn carried the bottle outside and buried it in the dirt, right at the edge of the old foundation. She told herself it was just a prank, maybe the locals trying to scare her off. But that night, she dreamed again, of a man's hand digging through the same patch of earth, unearthing the bottle, brushing the dirt away, and when she woke up the next morning, the bottle was back on her kitchen counter. That was the moment something inside her shifted. The historian in her began to fade. What took its place was obsession. She started hearing them more often. Faint voices murmuring in the walls, footsteps moving at night. Once she swore she heard children laughing softly near the hallway, followed by a woman's voice, gentle, patient, whispering, "It's almost ready." Evelyn stopped going to town. She stopped answering calls. Her notes became erratic, pages filled with looping handwriting that didn't sound like her voice anymore. "They aren't dead," one entry read. "They never left the table." The next week, a delivery driver found her front door wide open. The house inside was silent, spotless. Evelyn's car was still in the driveway. Her purse on the counter. There was no sign of her anywhere. Only one thing stood out. The table was set for 6. When police arrived, they noted the arrangement carefully. 5 of the plates were chipped and old, mismatched as though they'd been there for decades. The 6th was new, clean, modern. The meal, half served, was still warm, and on the radio, a faint static hum played beneath an old jazz tune. No trace of Evelyn Carr was ever found. A month later, her publisher received a package postmarked from the next town over. No return address. Inside was a stack of papers labeled The Langford Account, Final Draft. The manuscript was unlike anything she'd written before. It began as a factual retelling of the poisoning, but halfway through the tone changed. The writing became personal, almost confessional. In one section, she described meeting Margaret Langford in her dreams, sitting across from her at a table lit by candlelight. Margaret's hands were trembling, her eyes distant as she whispered, "He didn't want to die alone." In another passage, Evelyn claimed she'd tasted the stew, described it in vivid, sensory detail, its warmth, its bitterness, the smell of metal and fruit. The final page contained no words, only a faint ring, as if the bottom of a bottle had pressed against the paper. The publisher turned the manuscript over to authorities, but nothing came of it. The house was sealed again. No one wanted it after that. But 2 years later, in 2006, a construction company purchased the surrounding land for development. They planned to demolish what was left and build a row of new houses. On the second day of work, the foreman called the sheriff. His crew had uncovered something buried just beneath the surface where the old kitchen once stood. 5 small bowls arranged in a circle, each one filled with soil and what appeared to be fragments of bone. The bones were analyzed. They didn't belong to the Langfords. They were much older. Local historians determined the remains predated the farmhouse itself, possibly native burial fragments from the late 1800s. But what puzzled everyone was how they'd been placed, arranged so deliberately, almost ritualistically, as if the Langfords had unknowingly built their home on top of a grave. When the crew tried to continue, accidents began. Tools went missing. One worker fell from scaffolding and broke his leg. Another swore he'd seen a woman standing near the fence line holding a child's hand, both vanishing when he called out. The project was abandoned by winter. By then, the legend had grown. Teenagers began sneaking onto the property again, recording videos for online forums. Most of the footage was nonsense, shaky, dark, full of nervous laughter. But one clip posted anonymously in 2008 drew attention. It showed a group of friends walking through the overgrown field at night. The camera catches the faint outline of the old foundation, and then suddenly a sound. Glass clinking, soft, rhythmic, unmistakable. Then a whisper, "It's time for dinner." The clip ends with the camera dropping to the ground, showing only grass and sky. 2 of the people in that video disappeared days later. The others refused to speak publicly about what they'd seen. The video was removed shortly after, but not before copies spread online. Grainy, distorted, fueling the myth. Locals began calling the area the Langford Circle. Some said it was cursed. Others said it was haunted by something older than the family itself, something that had used Robert Langford's despair as an invitation. By 2010, the town council fenced off the property. A small weathered sign warned trespassers to keep out. But people still came, drawn by the story, the mystery, the silence. And the silence, it still has weight there. In 2019, a young journalist named Noah Reed visited to record a documentary on local American folklore. He brought cameras, sound equipment, and an assistant. They planned to spend one night there camping near the site. His recordings were later recovered. In the footage, the 2 men laugh at first, joking about ghost stories, drinking beer, calling out to the spirits. But around midnight, everything changes. The audio distorts. The air monitor picks up sudden fluctuations in pressure. Noah's assistant says he smells apples. Then, faintly through the static, whine a woman's voice, whispering, counting. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. A long pause. Then softly, 6. The camera jerks violently, the image blurring, and then cuts to black. Only Noah's body was found. Sitting upright near the foundation, eyes open, mouth slightly parted as if mid-conversation. The autopsy found no signs of struggle. No toxins in his blood, but his tongue was stained a deep, unnatural red, like he'd been drinking cider. The last file recovered from his recorder captured something faint in the background. The soft crackle of an old radio, playing the same 1930s jazz song that once filled the Langford house. It's been almost a century since that first dinner. The land is empty now. No houses, no fences, just a wind that never quite loses the scent of fruit and metal. But the locals still say that if you walk there at night, you'll hear the table setting itself. Forks tapping, glasses filling, the faint hiss of laughter from children long gone. And if you listen closely enough, you'll hear her, Margaret, still whispering the same word she whispered as she ran into the dark all those years ago. Cider, because the Langfords never left. They never meant to. They only wanted to dine together, and now it seems they always will, forever waiting for the next guest to take a seat, and every few years someone does.